I'm Jacob Harris.
And I'm Connor Walsh.
This is All or Nothing, episode 8, and today we're going to be talking about bloods. I got my bloods done, and I was heavily concerned, but Connor has reassured me, and I think everything's okay. But we're going to delve into them deeper to understand what we really need to be looking for. I'm going to learn, and so are you. This podcast is brought to you by PedTest Australia and Bulk Gym Chalk. Now, Connor, how are we going to start this off with what we're looking at? What do you want to address first?
There's a few different areas we could look at. Obviously, each part of blood work holds, in my opinion, fairly equal weight in terms of significance. All systems interrelate. So the other thing when you're looking at blood work is you're not necessarily looking at, say, a liver panel just for liver panel function, or a hormone panel for hormone function. Everything has interplay. So you can't look at, say, if you're trying to take two blood test results from two different dates and use those data ranges to come up with an overall picture. If they're from two different days, you can't, for example, like cortisol, if it's high, will increase fasting blood glucose. So if one morning you have a fasting blood glucose and your cortisol is normal, and your fasting blood glucose is normal, everything's, there's no issues there. And then the next day you go in and you have an elevated fasting cortisol level because I know you were stressed or something like that, or you had a poor sleep that led to an increase in cortisol, and now you have an increased fasting blood glucose level. This isn't necessarily showing that you have an issue with glucose metabolism. This is showing that you have an issue with cortisol. It's an acute cortisol spike that has caused your glucose to come up in blood levels as a result of cortisol. Is kind of obviously one of the reasons we release cortisol is in stressful situations to allow more energy to be kind of brought into the blood to be used as substrate. If we think back to a primal situation, if we're running from a predator or something, we need fuel in our bloodstream to help us get away. The cortisol is going to be released to bring up blood glucose, and provide us that energy. So when you're looking at blood work, you need to keep in mind that one value can have a interaction with another value, and just because that value is off, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's that value directly that's causing the issue, or there can be acute differences from one set of blood draw to the next. Another is, you see a lot of differences in training athletes.
This podcast is sponsored by PedTest Australia. If you plan on using or are currently using performance-enhancing drugs, it is very important that you make sure you are doing so, having them been tested before you use them or while you are using them, to make sure that you take care of your health. And you can also recommend that the people around you do so as well. Go to PedTest Australia on Instagram to find out more about the details on how you can test your current performance-enhancing drugs that you are using, or you can find out more about testing other compounds or things that you are putting in your body if you would like to make sure that you take care of your health.
If they've gone straight after day after a heavy leg day versus having 2 or 3 days off the gym, there's going to be blood markers that are going to be different there as well. So context in the time and kind of state that you're in when you've had blood tests drawn is important. But yeah, so effectively everything works as a whole. Nothing works in unison. So that you're always going to have interplay from one market to the next.
So if I'd handed you this right now, right? I mean, what do we have first up?
This one here is your full blood count.
And so rather, obviously we can't go into everything. There's a lot of stuff missing from this situation that would need to be a part of it for you to, let's say, comprehensively give a response that you were probably happy with and no one can take out of context. That's kind of how like a lot of things work.
Yep.
But let's say I've just handed this to you and we're having a 30-minute consult and much like we did when I showed you them, my response to you is, so far, what can you see here and what's your opinion on that result?
Okay, so if I were to look at this immediately, the first thing that I'm seeing is the flag neutrophil ratio, or just the flag neutrophil count. So you've got two portions of your blood, red blood cells and white blood cells. To keep things very simple, white blood cells are effectively part of your body's immune response that help fight bacteria and pathogens. Red blood cells are more of your nutrient and oxygen carrying capacity of your blood. So if we look here, have a look at your white cell ratios. I don't know if you'll be able to flash this up on the screen or something, possibly for the YouTube listeners. But we have a low neutrophil count, which also gives you a slightly less than a 1-to-1 neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. As I mentioned prior, because white blood cells are effectively your immune system's, call them soldiers would be probably the easiest analogy to use. They're what your immune system is using to go and fight things that it has identified as an issue to the body that it needs to kind of overcome. So you can reverse engineer white cell counts and white cell ratios to try and figure out why or what's going in the body for the body to want to have this immune response. So in the case of a 1-to-1 neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, typically you're seeing some form of inflammation and toxic load. So this could be lots of different things. Toxic load could be things like mold exposure, lead, any kind of environmental pollutants, anything like that. Even to some degree, certain vitamins can also have a little bit of a in play on these, such as vitamin D would be another way that you would be able to look in and kind of confirm if there is an inflammatory response potentially going on, or not confirm, but another way that you could kind of use to double check to confirm if that is an inflammatory response. Often vitamin D will be elevated in response to a toxic load situation, which is causing inflammation. Common one would be something like mold. So that would be kind of the first thing that's sticking out of your blood count.
So to simplify that and what you're saying, that this podcast is sponsored by Bulk Gym Chalk. Do you struggle to hold onto your deadlifts? If so, it can be very important to make sure that you have good quality chalk and access to that chalk. So go to Bulk Gym Chalk. You can find them on Instagram and get yourself some good quality chalk so that you can make sure that you can train in the gym and get the best out of your training while doing so. I think Connor's prefaced it enough with what he's saying that he's not just flat out saying anything really. He's putting a lot of things in context. So if you take this with full certainty, that's on you. I want to make that pretty certain. But what you're saying is that could possibly mean that I'm essentially in an environment where I would be inhaling mold. Like, let's say I'm in like a really crappy old house and maybe something's going on in the roof, or
definitely.
Yeah.
So look, to me, it's just saying that there is most likely some form of toxic load which is causing inflammation. So now it would be the next thing that you would do. Okay, so I'm obviously seeing some form of toxic load and inflammation. What possible things am I exposed to that could be causing this? Then I would go through, I'd have a look at kind of your lifestyle, things that you're exposed to, things that you're at a higher risk of, and then you'd go and do further testing in those areas to see if you can actually identify the root cause of the issue. This is never going to tell you the root cause. It's just going to give you a bit of a ballpark as to what kind of a sickness or whatever you might be dealing with, as to why your body is responding in that way to try and overcome whatever it is that it's trying to fight, or whatever immune response it's trying to have.
And so what would you be looking into? Like, for instance, if we're talking mold, or we don't know that, right? But we're using that as an example. Would you not look at like your first port of call in terms of maybe getting some scans or looking at like a body part or something like that? We obviously can see that there's something reflected in the blood work. Would I be looking at an area like the lungs or something to see if there's anything built there?
I know you can actually go and get mold blood tests.
Or you can just get a specific.
Yeah, you can actually just go test for stuff like that. Heavy metals is another big one, especially if you've been exposed to like older cooking ware that's got some of your lead dyes and stuff and lead paints in it. That's another one that's still fairly common. Even people that eat lots of tuna are obviously exposed to excess mercury potentially.
How much like on a realistic level, like what's the risk associated with a lot of this stuff? Is it a certain situation where it's to be considered and there would be extreme cases, but for the most part, is this probably just fairly common and not something that people are really seeing a lot of adverse effects from? Or
toxic load, or
yeah.
Obviously there's a spectrum. It's going to be a very large spectrum to it. If it's a single once-off acute reading, you get blood work done every 3 months, and you've just got this one reading that's off, and then kind of returns to baseline next time you have it done. It's probably just an acute exposure short term to something that's caused a acute reaction to the immune system. If you're seeing consistently skewed white blood cell ratios, then there's obviously something that's chronically going on, something that's a long-term issue that your body's dealing with and trying to fight. Um, so yeah, look, I would say it is alarming. I wouldn't kind of blow your load over seeing some skewed white cell ratios to begin with, because as I said, it's a normal response. Obviously, we're always going to be exposed to different pathogens and bacteria and whatnot, and that's why we have white blood cells, is so that our body is able to fight and kind of overcome these things that we're exposed to. Um,
So the next step is for me would be to get a more specific mold test.
Yeah, and look, if you're not suffering any symptoms, you feel completely healthy, and you've never had any issue in the past, it may actually be worth just kind of giving yourself a couple of weeks, going back, pulling the same bloods again, and seeing if the white cell ratios are still skewed. Because it is possible you've just picked up a cold or something like, just something very small and benign along the way, and you've had a small immune response to whatever you've picked up, and now you've dealt with it and you're fine, and it's not an issue.
This podcast is sponsored by Power Pit Rockingham, and Power Pit Rockingham is probably the best gym for you to train in if you are in Rockingham and want access to quality powerlifting equipment and a good environment to train in when it comes to powerlifting training or bodybuilding training. If you are in the area and want to do so, pop on down to Power Pit Rockingham, jump in for a casual session, and tell them that the Porta Potty sent you.
It's more obviously when we're seeing chronic long-term immune responses, it's not healthy for your immune system to be chronically in overload trying to fight off, um, you know, let's say it's a mold toxicity or something like that, or anything of that nature. So yeah, the time frame is definitely important. If you've done things that what if, for example, if you were sanding your car or something, and you've gone out and inhaled a ton of paint the last week, and you go in and you have your white blood cell counts pulled and you're off. Well, I mean, you've probably just exposed yourself to a bunch of toxic pollutants and whatnot. So it's probably a pretty normal result. So don't do that again. Go have them tested again and then see if there's still something that's present in your blood that's still causing a response.
Mm-hmm. We didn't check this to begin with, and I have no problem with breaking the fourth wall. And Gabe's moving around a lot anyway. So it's okay, Gabe. People can know that you're here. It's fine. But do you have a timer there for us?
I can't think how long we've been recording.
Mm-hmm. I'm okay. 22 minutes. So we've covered a fair bit in this time. Is there anything that you want to do to elaborate on this, or can we carry this on to the next episode?
Um, Look, as I've kind of already made a pretty solid point on, is a lot of nuance within blood work. There's look, there's definitely some more areas that we can go over here that are completely fine with you. But just to give the listeners a little bit more insight, especially on the performance side of things, red blood cells and red blood cell counts are very important for performance. Your hemoglobin is obviously what carries oxygen around your body. Without a decent amount of hemoglobin and red blood cells, you're not going to have a efficient ability to transport oxygen to working muscles. So people with low hemoglobin and low red blood cell counts are going to have a hard time functioning under oxygen demanding exercises for long periods of time, because their capacity to deliver oxygen to the muscles is just not going to be as efficient as someone with a high level of hemoglobin. That's why in sports like cycling, you see drugs like erythropoietin, which increase red blood cell count and therefore hemoglobin levels to increase the endurance and oxygen carry capacity of cyclists, endurance runners, stuff like that. So you've got a 153, which is right in the middle of the range. For athletic performances, I tend to like to see people on the upper end of that range, kind of in the 160 to 170 mark, just because it does improve oxygen carrying capacity, will lead to improved performance, and you don't tend to have any of the negative kind of health side effects with running on the upper end of that range, providing the blood pressure and heart rate and stuff like that still monitored.
This podcast is sponsored by Achievement Apex. Achievement Apex creates some of the best barbells in the world, and they supply some of these barbells to some of the strongest power lifters and athletes in the world. If you want an Achievement Apex barbell, you can go to achievementapex.com and use the code PortaPotty for 10% off any order that you make.
Obviously, this is an area, especially in steroid and performance-enhancing drug users, that tends to become a potential concern because the drugs themselves are also driving up red blood cell count and hemoglobin. So that's something you will want to keep an eye on, but you still do want to have it running towards the top end to kind of optimize performance capacity there as well. Another quite simple marker, which yours is a pretty good number, that you can look for overall micronutrient status is your RDW, or your red cell distribution width. This measurement is effectively taking your smallest red blood cell to the largest red blood cell and measuring the difference in size between the smallest and largest red blood cell in your circulating blood. The larger the number, the greater the difference in size, which means there's less of a constant supply of the correct micronutrients to have basically a consistent replication process of the red blood cells. So in somebody who is either getting insufficient micronutrients, and often the ones that are going to be your biggest contributor to this are going to be stuff like zinc, copper, obviously iron to some degree, a lot of your mineral and folate as well as another vitamin that has another big impact on your RDW and blood counts. Another thing that you'll see with RDW, if it's really elevated, kind of in your 16, 17, 18 plus range, often those people have some kind of digestive or food intolerance that's causing the high RDW rather than a micronutrient insufficiency. And unless they're eating absolutely horrendous, most foods, I mean, even the majority of processed foods are fortified these days, so severe micronutrient deficiencies are probably not going to cause an elevation of something like an 18 on an RDW. If you're seeing an 18, checking yourself for stuff like gluten intolerances and sensitivities is probably a good idea, because that's probably what's causing your body's inability to efficiently deal with your food and take the correct micronutrients out and do what it needs to do with those micronutrients to sustain healthy function and vascular function as well. So there are some more bits and pieces we can go through on that, but it starts to get a little bit more complicated. I feel like we're already, on a bit of a tangent here, so we'll try and keep things fairly simple.
Well, I know that you said a lot of big words, and people are listening, and people like big words, and I also enjoyed those big words. So I'm going to finish it by sounding like an absolute NPC with how I just said that, because I feel like I actually learned a lot. Mainly, I was interested in the mold side of things, because obviously when you first had said something to me after we'd initially gotten these results, I was quite curious about that, and I have not followed it up, but I will, especially after this. So I think that was an interesting topic to at least touch on. And as you said, I think everything we go through here can be extensive if we let it.
Yep.
But I think that we went over that efficiently.
Yeah, for sure.
We're going to cap that at episode 8. And this is probably just going to be followed by many more episodes of us going through my blood work and just kind of looking at it, talking about certain things, kind of helping us understand what to look for in some of these circumstances. And we're going to go from there. So I am Jacob Harris.
I'm Connor Walsh.
This has been episode 8, All or Nothing. We'll see you next time.